Welcome to Miyconst hardware. As you can see, I'm not home at the moment, so I do not have access to my hardware to do different benchmarks and different tests. That's why I have decided to record a short status update video about Intel LGA 2011 version 3 platform in the second half of 2022. In this video, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about the Chinese X99 motherboards, Xeon E5, V3 and V4 CPUs, but also Turbo Boost Unlock status update. In this guide, I'm going to cover only the LGA 2011 version 3 or so-called X99 platform. If you can afford buying something modern, for example LGA 1200 or AMD AM4 or even LGA 1700, then I strongly recommend you to buy the newer parts. In 2022, LGA 2011 version 3 is only relevant for ultra-budget gaming computers and workstations or servers where you need to utilize lots of RAM and many PCI Express lanes. I also always recommend to buy exactly what you need. Do not try to fool yourself by buying something expensive for the sake of future-proofness. Buying an expensive X99 motherboard for the sake of future upgrades makes absolutely no sense. If you need some features of an expensive X99 motherboard, that's totally fine, but if you're buying for the sake of future upgrades, that makes no sense. And the last thing I need to mention is that the links in this presentation are affiliated. If you buy something following these links, I will get a small commission, and that helps me and supports my channel. First, I need to start with the common questions and common issues of the LGA 2011 version 3 platform. Many of you probably know most of these things, so if you're not interested to listen, just use the timestamps in the video description to skip to the chapter you're interested in. So, once again, it is not possible to overclock any locked Xeon E5 CPUs. All Xeon E5 2600 and 4600 series CPUs are locked. You cannot overclock them using the CPU clock multiplier. There are only a few Xeon E5 3rd series which can be overclocked, and these are Xeon E5 1650 and Xeon E5 1660. All Xeon E5 V4 CPUs are completely locked. You cannot overclock them using the CPU clock multiplier. It is also not possible to implement the Turbo Boost Unlock procedure with the V4 Xeons. On the other hand, CPUs with unlocked multipliers such as Core i7 or E5 1650-1660 V3 are not compatible with the Turbo Boost Unlocked BIOS. For example, if you have a budget motherboard with the E5 2620 V3 and you have implemented Turbo Boost Unlock, later on you would like to upgrade to a Core i7 or maybe Xeon E5 1650-1660 V3 which have unlocked multiplier. Then you have to first restore your original BIOS with no modifications for Turbo Boost Unlock and only then swap your CPU. If you swap the CPU without restoring the original BIOS, your motherboard will not boot. All Xeon E5 CPUs have their own TDP limit, and even if you implement Turbo Boost, your CPU will downclock itself to stay within this limit. Yes, I know that there are some hacks which are claiming to remove this limit, but in reality, implementing this hack increases the CPU power consumption significantly, but the performance is about the same. With the Chinese X99 motherboards that come with not the best VRAM, this hack is extremely dangerous because the power consumption is really enormous and the VRAM will just burn out. I strongly do not recommend to use it. It is also not possible to overclock memory with the locked Xeons. For example, Xeon E5 V3 CPUs usually have a limitation at DDR4 2133. The lower-end models such as E5 2620 and E5 2640 are limited to DDR4 1866. Xeon E5 V4 CPUs are usually supporting DDR4 2400, but the lower models are limited to DDR4 2133. With the unlocked CPUs such as i7 5000 series and the Xeon E5 1650-1660 V3, it is possible to overclock memory. With the Chinese motherboards, the limit is DDR4 2400, and with i7 6000 series, you can increase the memory speed to DDR4 2600. CPU undervolting with the Turbo Boost Unlock is required to decrease CPU power consumption at the same frequency. This means that if your CPU is hitting the TDP limit with the default voltage and starts to reduce its clock from the maximum turbo frequency, then reducing the voltage will help your CPU maintain higher frequency, because the CPU will consume less power and this means it will be able to maintain higher frequency with the same TDP. To undervolt your CPU, you need to either use different FFS or EFI drivers when implementing the Turbo Boost unlock. Also, if you're using the Ultimate Patcher tool to implement Turbo Boost unlock, then you can adjust the voltage right in the BIOS. I will talk about this a bit later. BSLK or best clock overclocking is impossible with all Chinese X99 motherboards. With the branded motherboards, it also doesn't make much sense, because increasing the base clock increases the power consumption of your CPU. Increased power consumption means that the CPU hits the TDP limit quicker, and then it starts to downclock itself even though the base clock is more than 100 MHz. Lately, most of the Chinese X99 motherboards are using the desktop chipsets such as H81, B85Q87. With this chipset, it is not possible to overclock unlocked CPUs. With all chipsets, it is possible to implement Turbo Boost unlock. Z87 theoretically has possibility to overclock unlocked CPUs, but so far we do not have a single motherboard with a single BIOS modification that would allow that on the LGA 2011 version 3 platform. Now let's move to the most common issues of the LGA 2011 version 3 platform, starting with the DDR3 RAM compatibility. Most of you know that there are many X99 motherboards with DDR3 memory slots, but also many of you do not know that for DDR3 motherboards, you need a special CPU that would also support DDR3, not only DDR4. The full list of these CPUs you will see on your screen, but the most interesting ones are Xeon E5-2666v3 and Xeon E5-2696v3. You may also get some extra memory compatibility issues when using DDR4. Memory modules with only 4 or 8 memory banks might not be compatible with the Chinese X99 motherboards. Memory bank is not equal to memory capacity, but in general, memory modules with higher capacity have more memory banks. Still, it doesn't guarantee that a 16GB memory module will have certain number of memory banks. For the best compatibility, I recommend to buy ECC registered memory and use only identical memory modules. Another thing I need to cover is the M.2 SSDs. First of all, M.2 is the physical shape or the physical connector of an SSD to the motherboard. You may have M.2 SATA SSD or M.2 NVMe SSD. These two are not the same, and if your motherboard does not support SATA SSDs, your M.2 SATA SSD will not be visible. If your motherboard does not support NVMe SSDs, your M.2 NVMe SSD won't be visible. Please pay attention to this and make sure to buy the correct SSD and the correct motherboard for your needs. It is also a very common issue when China-branded NVMe SSDs are simply not compatible with the Chinese X99 motherboards. The SSD works just fine on any other branded motherboard, but the Chinese X99 motherboards simply do not see the SSD. So far, I have not seen this issue with the branded SSDs. One last thing I'm going to mention is the engineering samples of the Xeon E5v4 CPUs. Right now on AliExpress you can find many of them for very cheap, but unfortunately these CPUs are not recommended. First of all, the Chinese X99 motherboards are often refusing to work with these engineering samples at all. These engineering samples may also come with unknown or hidden issues. For example, the clock frequency is reduced, the memory controller frequency is reduced, the CPU is crashing under certain workloads, or the CPU is refusing to work in a pair. In general, I do not test engineering samples of Xeon E5v4 CPUs, and I do not recommend buying them. Sometimes you can find qualification or QS samples, and these are supposed to be exactly the same as their retail chips and should be working just fine. But I have not tested many of them, thus I cannot confirm or deny it. In 2022, we have two major methods to implement Turbo Boost unlock. The first one is the S3 Turbo tool. It uses exactly the same procedure as I have demonstrated previously with the FFS driver injection into the BIOS. But FFS driver of S3 Turbo tool must be injected into a different region of the BIOS. You also need to adjust the CPU C-state settings in a different way. All the details you can see on your screen, but from myself I will add that using FFS drivers from S3 Turbo tool, we do not lose the sleep mode. So if your motherboard originally supports the sleep mode, you can keep using it even after implementing the Turbo Boost unlock. Another thing about S3 Turbo Tool is that it is possible to implement Turbo Boost Unlock with the dual-socket motherboards. The original FFS injection method didn't work with the dual-socket motherboards. This one does work, but in case of a dual-socket motherboard, we still lose the sleep mode. The other method is the Ultimate Patcher tool. This is a small, nice program which is able to modify your BIOS completely on its own. You only need to specify your BIOS file and select the features you want. Unfortunately, this little program works only with X99 and C612 chipset, so if you're trying to modify BIOS from a motherboard with a desktop chipset, it will either fail or produce a BIOS that will break your motherboard. Apart of the Turbo Boost Unlock, the Ultimate Patcher tool also provides some extra additional fixes which are nice to have. But the most important thing is that the tool allows you to adjust voltage straight from the BIOS. Thus, you can implement CPU undervolting without risking to break your motherboard, and you can do that without reflashing your BIOS on each try. Just like the last time, I'm going to start with Huananzhi X99-F8, TF and T8 motherboards. This trio has been updated to version 2.0 and it is still the best Chinese X99 motherboard. Unfortunately, these motherboards make no sense in 2022 because the price has increased to 125 euros plus VAT plus delivery. We still have the same features, the best VRAM, lots of PCI Express slots, a couple of M.2 slots, quad-channel memory support, and DDR3 or DDR4 memory variants. With the 2.0 version, we also have some negatives. The stock BIOS does not have overclocking support and doesn't have memory timings. We have a good BIOS from iEngineer, but the BIOS cannot be flushed with AlphaWin because it doesn't write all the BIOS regions, and even though the flush succeeds, the configuration is not stable. It's important to mention that the BIOS 1.0 and 2.0 are not compatible with each other. Machinist X99-MR9A and MR9A Pro. Just a couple of months ago, this motherboard was on sale for about 60–65 euros. Right now the price is about 85 euros plus VAT plus delivery, so it is not that attractive. For 65 euros it was a good alternative for budget builds. The motherboard comes with a desktop chipset B85 or C226. Nevertheless, it has lots of connectivity and 4 memory slots with quad-channel memory configuration. The VRAM or the power delivery system is also good enough to host E5-2666v3. Thus, if the price is right, I can recommend it for the budget builds, but you need to flush it with Huananzhi X99-8MF BIOS because the stock BIOS from Machinist is just pathetic. Huananzhi X99-QD4 is another cheap alternative. The motherboard comes with the same desktop B85 C226 chipset, but this time in M80X form factor. We still have a couple of PCI Express slots, 4 memory slots for DDR4 in quad-channel configuration. The motherboard has OK VRAM for E5-2666v3, good stock BIOS, and sleep mode works. So if you find the motherboard for a good price, feel free to buy it for budget builds. I have not yet tested the motherboard myself, but if there will be enough demand, I will buy one and do some detailed testing. Machinist X99-G7 is a desperate option for those who want an M80X motherboard with a DDR3 memory support. Even though the motherboard is cheap, combining with the most popular E5-2666v3 is not the safest option. The VRAM of X99-G7 is simply too weak and E5-2666v3 can easily overheat and burn it. Still, if you're desperate enough to buy this motherboard and pair it with E5-2666 or similar CPU, please make sure to install extra cooling over the VRAM zone so it doesn't cook itself. The motherboard also does not support DDR3 2133, so you will be limited to DDR3 1866, and the first PCI Express slot doesn't work. Also, just like any other Machinist motherboard, it comes with a pathetic BIOS, so I strongly recommend to use Huananzhi X99-8MF BIOS if you happen to have X99-G7 motherboard. Walram X99-85D3 is a potentially better option than X99-G7 because it has a better VRAM, but so far we do not know much about the motherboard except that it has 4 memory slots for DDR3 memory, and it also comes with a desktop B85 C226 chipset. I don't know if the motherboard supports a full 4 memory channels or it is limited to 2 memory channels, and I also don't know if the BIOS is decent or disastrous. Quality of the motherboard is also unknown, so buy at your own risk, but if there will be enough interest, I will also buy and test this motherboard. Finally, let's talk about the dual socket configurations. So far, Huananzhi X99-F8D and Huananzhi X99-F8D+ are the only motherboards that I can somehow recommend to buy for dual socket configurations from China. Personally, I have tested X99-F8D motherboard, and that motherboard is still running perfectly fine in a custom-built server. But many of you, for some unknown reason, are trying to build gaming computers with the 2 CPUs. Please do not do that. Dual CPUs are only good when you can actually use both of the CPUs and utilize these many PCI Express slots. If you really badly want one of these motherboards, then feel free to buy, but right now they cost about 210 euros plus VAT plus shipping cost. For this money you would much better be with the modern LGA 1700 or AMD AM4 platform. Here is a short list of Intel Xeon E5, V3 and V4 CPUs that are particularly interesting in the third quarter of 2022. The first one is Xeon E5 2640 V3. The CPU costs just 23 euros plus VAT plus shipping cost. It comes with 8 cores and 16 threads, 3.4 GHz frequency and up to DDR4 1866. The CPU can be used for ultra-budget gaming computers, but also for workstations or office-like workloads. A slightly better option would be Xeon E5 2666 V3. This one costs 30 euros plus VAT plus shipping, but it comes with the 10 cores, 3.5 GHz frequency and DDR4 2133, as well as DDR3 2133 support. The gaming performance is somewhere around Core i5-10400, and the productivity performance is somewhere around Ryzen 7 1700X or maybe even Ryzen 7 2700. Another CPU you might be interested in is Xeon E5 2683 V3. It also costs the same 30 euros, but it comes with 14 cores and 28 threads. The CPU clock frequency though is only 3 GHz. Memory speed is also DDR4 2133. The CPU might be interesting to those who want to assemble a low-power server. Another alternative for the low-power servers is Xeon E5 2650 V4. For the same price of 30 euros, you are getting 12 cores, 24 threads, 2.4 GHz maximum frequency and DDR4 2400. E5 2650 V4 would be slightly slower than E5 2686 V3 with a turbo boost unlock, but it will consume significantly less power. The last Xeon I would pay my attention to is Xeon E5 2696 V3. The CPU price is rather high, 135 euros plus VAT plus shipping, but it comes with 18 cores, 3.8 GHz maximum turbo frequency, and DDR3, DDR4 2133 support. The CPU might be a good fit for basically anything if you really want to have a Xeon. For gaming, you can disable hyperthreading and a few CPU cores, so in games the CPU will be running at 3.8 GHz all the time. For servers or workstations, you can combine the CPU with a cheap DDR3 memory, which helps you save some money. Of course, there are also many other CPUs that you may consider. For example, E5 2620 V3 very often can be found for less than 15 euros, but 15 or 23 euros is not that big of a difference, while 2640 V3 is much faster. Sometimes E5 2680 V3 or E5 2690 V3 are going down in price, and then it is a better option than E5 2640 V3. Still, it is hard to beat the value of E5 2666 V3 with about 30 euros price tag. E5 2697 V3 and E5 2698 V3 are also sometimes competing with E5 2696 V3, but at the moment these CPUs are priced rather badly, so I would either go with E5 2696 V3 or E5 2666 V3. And that's all you need to know about the LGA 2011 version 3 platform in the second half of 2022. I hope it was interesting and helpful. I hope you have enjoyed it. So thanks for watching, thanks for listening, bye bye.